Something felt wrong the second she stepped on our porch. Not just wrong off like we were about to be trapped in something bigger than a fake HOA inspection. My wife stood her ground while I filmed from the screen door, heart pounding because everything in this woman's voice screamed authority, but none of it made sense. When someone shows up waving papers that look official but can't answer questions, you know something's about to go sideways. I've never felt so cornered on my own property. Let me know in the comments if you'd have handled it differently, because I still don't know if we made the right call. I never thought the woman banging on our door about lake inspection would be the one with a federal warrant. Saturday morning came with perfect lake weather, but there was something wrong with the way this stranger moved across our porch. Too deliberate, too practiced, like she'd rehearsed this whole performance before. I was inside making coffee when I heard voices getting louder. And the tone made me stop what I was doing, because it carried this edge of desperation that you feel in your gut before you understand it. Rachel was standing on our porch facing down this woman I recognized as Diane Mercer, our 45-year-old HOA president. And both women looked like they were preparing for war. Diane was waving around this stack of papers, like they were some kind of legal weapon. But there was something off about the way she held them too tight, like she was afraid they might blow away and expose something. "I'm not letting you inside this cabin," Rachel said, her voice ice cold and completely firm, like she was talking to a door-to-door salesman selling something she definitely didn't want. I whispered from behind the screen door that I wasn't sure about this whole situation, but Rachel didn't budge an inch, didn't even glance back at me for support. She just crossed her arms and stared Diane down with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're absolutely right about something important. The papers Diane was holding looked like she'd printed them at home on regular copy paper, the kind you buy at any office supply store, and I could see obvious spelling errors even from where I stood behind the screen. She kept calling them emergency cabin structure inspection documents for lake safety violations. But something about her whole presentation felt rehearsed in a way that made my skin crawl. Rachel spent 3 years working as a county property paperwork checker before we moved to the lake. So, she knows exactly what official documents should look like, what kind of paper they use, what the stamps look like. When Rachel said Diane had zero authority to inspect our cabin, I watched something flicker across Diane's face that looked almost like panic before the aggressive mask slipped back into place. Our cabin had been sitting on this lake for 15 years before we bought it. Built with all the proper permits and inspections, but Diane was pointing at everything like she was conducting some kind of official survey that would determine our fate. She claimed everything violates community lake safety standards and kept gesturing at our perfectly legal dock like it was some kind of environmental disaster waiting to happen. Rachel stayed calm and explained that the papers in our family name show this entire lake belongs to us, not the HOA, that we've owned this property since before the HOA even existed. I could see Diane's hand starting to shake slightly when property records got mentioned, and she kept shifting her weight from foot to foot like she was getting nervous about something we couldn't see coming. What happened next still makes my blood pressure spike when I think about it, because it crossed the line from argument to actual attempted trespassing in broad daylight. Diane actually tried to push past Rachel to peer inside our cabin like she had some kind of legal right to enter our property without permission or a warrant. Rachel blocked the doorway completely, not moving an inch despite being smaller than Diane, planting herself like a bouncer at a club who wasn't going to let someone in without proper identification. That's when I finally stepped outside for the first time, still recording, and firmly told Diane to leave our property immediately. But the whole situation was escalating way too fast for what should have been a simple HOA dispute. But here's the thing that really threw me off and made me realize we were dealing with someone who wasn't thinking clearly about the consequences of her actions. When Rachel produced our actual deed showing lake ownership, complete with official seals and county stamps, Diane didn't back down at all like a reasonable person would. Instead, she got more aggressive, practically shouting that she didn't care what our fake papers said, that this cabin was unsafe and needed immediate inspection. I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one, trying to process what I just heard come out of her mouth. Did she seriously just call our legal property deed fake while holding obviously forged inspection documents in her trembling hands? Diane stormed off toward her car, still muttering about safety violations and community standards. Her fake papers clutched in her hands like they were some kind of sacred text that would protect her from reality. Rachel and I stood there watching her drive away, both of us trying to process what had just happened and figure out what we were supposed to do next about this completely unhinged woman. Rachel shook her head and looked at me like she couldn't believe what we just experienced, saying that woman was completely unhinged and probably dangerous. I agreed completely, but watching Diane's car disappear down the road, I got this sinking feeling in my stomach that told me this was just the beginning of something much worse. Something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And whatever was driving Diane to act this crazy, I had a feeling something much darker was coming our way than just fake paperwork and neighborhood drama. What would I even tell the police that our HOA president tried to inspect our cabin with fake papers and got angry when we refused? By Monday morning, Diane had declared all-out war on our cabin. And I mean that literally, because what she did next was like nothing I'd ever seen from a neighbor dispute. I woke up to find bright orange unsafe cabin structure notices plastered directly on our front door, covering almost the entire surface like we were some kind of condemned building. The notices were obviously printed on regular paper and taped up with cheap masking tape, but they looked official enough to make neighbors stop and stare. Rachel pulled them down immediately, but the damage was done because people were stopping to take pictures and asking questions. The whole thing felt like a coordinated attack designed to embarrass us and make our neighbors think we were operating some kind of dangerous property. The neighborhood community app exploded with Diane's posts about us endangering families with illegal lake cabin modifications. And I'm talking about multiple posts every hour with increasingly dramatic language. She shared photos of our dock, calling it a dangerous violation that threatens community safety, and posted long paragraphs about how concerned residents needed to take action before someone got hurt. I couldn't believe someone would go this far over a fake inspection dispute, but there it was in black and white for everyone to see. The comment section turned into a battlefield with neighbors taking sides based on absolutely nothing but Diane's word. I found myself scrolling through the posts, feeling sick to my stomach, watching our reputation get destroyed by someone with obvious fake documents. That afternoon, things got even weirder when Diane showed up with a measuring tape and clipboard like she was conducting some kind of official scientific study of our property. She started measuring our cabin's distance from the waterline, taking photos and notes while walking around our yard like she owned the place. When I confronted her about trespassing again, she claimed she was documenting violations for the county and held up her clipboard like it gave her some kind of legal authority. The audacity was unbelievable, but I kept my cool and told her to leave our property again. This time, making sure to film everything. She just smirked and kept taking measurements, acting like I was the one causing problems. Rachel called the actual county office to check if they had any record of an inspection request, and the conversation confirmed everything we already suspected. The clerk on the phone sounded confused and confirmed they had absolutely no pending inspections for our property, no requests for inspections, and no record of anyone named Diane Mercer being authorized to represent the county. "Ma'am, if someone's claiming to represent the county, they're lying," the clerk said, and asked if we wanted to file a complaint about someone impersonating a county official. That's when we knew for sure Diane was running some kind of elaborate scam. But proving it to the neighbors was going to be another challenge entirely, because people tend to believe the first story they hear. I decided to fight back through the community app by posting a blurred photo of our lake deed, keeping the details private but proving ownership. The post explained that our family has owned this lake and cabin for decades with all the proper legal documentation filed with the county. Within an hour, my post got reported multiple times by anonymous users and somehow got buried at the bottom of the feed. Meanwhile, Diane's safety violation post stayed pinned at the top, getting more comments and shares every hour. The whole thing felt rigged, like she had people helping her manipulate the online discussion. The community response split exactly like I expected it would, with people choosing sides based on incomplete information rather than facts. About half the neighbors bought into Diane's safety concerns without asking questions about her authority, just accepting that if someone official looking said there was a problem, there must be a problem. The other half started questioning why the HOA president was suddenly interested in one specific cabin, especially when other properties had similar structures. A few people asked to see Diane's credentials, which made her posts get more defensive and angry. The whole situation was turning our peaceful lake community into a war zone. That's when things took a really strange turn that made me realize Diane might be threatening people behind the scenes. Owen Parker, a neighbor who initially supported us and questioned Diane's authority, suddenly switched sides after having a private conversation with her. His comments went from "this seems like harassment" to "cabin safety is everyone's responsibility" overnight, like someone had flipped a switch in his brain. What could Diane have possibly said to change his mind so completely? Looking back, I think she was threatening people somehow, maybe claiming legal liability or HOA fines, but I had no proof at the time and Owen wouldn't talk to me. All I knew was that someone who had been reasonable suddenly became hostile. The anonymous note appeared wedged in our cabin doorframe on Wednesday evening, and finding it there felt like a scene from a thriller movie. It was a photocopy so blurry you could barely make out 3 words. Failure to appear. Someone in this community knew something about Diane that we didn't know, something serious enough that they felt compelled to warn us, but not brave enough to come forward directly. The handwriting looked deliberately disguised, and the paper felt like it came from a cheap home printer. Was someone trying to help us or set us up for something worse? The timing felt too convenient, showing up right when Diane was escalating her campaign against us. Rachel found the note first and brought it inside, looking worried, holding it like it might explode in her hands. "Daniel, what if she's planning something bigger than fake inspections?" she asked, and I could see the stress starting to get to her after days of constant harassment. I stared at that blurry photocopy, trying to figure out what failure to appear could mean in this context. Was it a court document, a legal notice, some kind of warrant or summons that Diane had ignored? Someone clearly wanted us to know. Diane had skeletons in her closet. Serious legal problems that might explain why she was so aggressive about establishing false authority over our property. But they weren't brave enough to come forward directly. That night, I couldn't sleep, lying in bed thinking about the anonymous warning and Owen's sudden change of heart, trying to piece together what kind of game Diane was really playing. Staring at that note on our kitchen table, I kept wondering the same thing over and over. The question that was driving me crazy because I couldn't answer it. Is the person who sent this trying to help us or hurt us? Either way, I had a feeling we were about to find out exactly what Diane Mercer was really running from, and I wasn't sure we were prepared for whatever that truth might be. Thursday brought a development that made everything we'd experienced so far look like child's play compared to what Diane was planning next, and I started wondering if maybe we'd misunderstood something fundamental about those inspection papers. Around noon, she returned with backup this time, bringing 2 other HOA board members I barely recognized and Owen Parker trailing behind them like he was part of some official delegation. They marched up to our cabin carrying an actual ladder, tools, and what looked like official inspection equipment borrowed from somewhere, which made me second-guess everything Rachel had said about the paperwork being fake. Diane had clearly spent time organizing this little expedition, and seeing 4 people approach our property with serious intent made my stomach drop, because maybe we were the ones who had gotten something wrong. Owen was actually supporting Diane's position when they first arrived, which completely caught me off guard because he'd seemed reasonable during previous HOA meetings about neighborhood issues. He kept nodding along as Diane announced to her little crew that they were conducting an emergency cabin compliance inspection under HOA emergency powers, which sounded impressive and made me wonder if there were regulations I didn't know about. One of the board members, a nervous-looking guy in his 60s, kept glancing around like he wasn't sure he should be there, but Owen seemed confident about the whole procedure. The other board member, a woman about Diane's age, seemed more confident, but kept checking her phone like she was following some kind of official protocol that required documentation. I'd heard from a neighbor last week that another cabin had been fined for unauthorized repairs, which made me think maybe there really was some kind of community-wide safety initiative that we'd missed during our vacation. That's when Diane did something that crossed every line I thought existed in neighbor disputes. But maybe it was more official than I realized because Owen wasn't objecting. She actually climbed onto our deck without permission and started examining our cabin's exterior walls, prying at loose boards and claiming she was checking for structural violations that pose immediate safety threats. Rachel came outside just as Diane was trying to peer through our windows. And I could see the fury building in my wife's face as she watched this woman treating our home like her personal inspection site. The two board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as they watched Diane's unauthorized inspection unfold, and I could tell they were starting to realize they'd been dragged into something way beyond normal HOA business, which made me feel less crazy about resisting. The nervous guy finally spoke up, asking Diane who exactly authorized this cabin inspection, but she brushed off the question with some nonsense about emergency community safety protocols that sounded less official the more she talked. When he pressed further, asking to see the actual authorization documents, Diane's confident mask slipped for just a second before she launched into an angry rant about how questioning her authority was endangering the entire community. The whole performance was so obviously fake that I couldn't believe these people had agreed to come along, especially Owen, who had seemed so supportive at first. This is where Rachel and I had our first real disagreement about how to handle the escalating situation. And honestly, I'm not proud of how I handled it because I was still half convinced we might be wrong. I suggested we just let them do their fake inspection to end this nightmare, thinking maybe if we gave Diane what she wanted, she'd finally leave us alone and we could figure out the truth later. Rachel looked at me like I'd suggested we hand over the keys to our house, saying if we give in now, she'll never stop. And she was absolutely right, even though I couldn't see it at the time. We ended up arguing in front of the neighbors for the first time, which felt humiliating, but also helped me understand that Rachel's instincts about this whole situation were probably better than mine. While we were arguing, I noticed Owen getting more and more agitated, pacing around, and checking his watch, like he had somewhere else to be or was having second thoughts about supporting Diane's authority. When one of the board members asked him directly why he thought this inspection was necessary, Owen couldn't give a straight answer, just mumbling something about community responsibility and safety concerns that didn't sound convincing. But then something interesting happened that gave me the first real clue about what Diane might be hiding from all of us. When I mentioned that we'd already verified with the county that no official inspection was requested, Owen's face went completely white and he started backing toward his car like he'd just realized something terrible. That evening, I decided to do some serious investigating into our HA president's background because nothing about her behavior made sense for someone who was supposed to be representing community interests in good faith. I started with basic internet searches using her name and found some interesting results, including old photos from her previous town where she was using the name Diane Mills instead of Mercer. The photos showed her at community events and HOA meetings, always positioned as some kind of authority figure, always holding official-looking papers that might have been as fake as the ones she'd shown us. What really caught my attention was an old newspaper article mentioning a Diane Mills who had left town suddenly after some kind of financial controversy involving homeowner assessments, which made everything about her behavior start to make sense. The anonymous note appeared wedged in our cabin doorframe on Wednesday evening, and finding it there felt like a scene from a thriller movie that was starting to make sense. It was a photocopy so blurry you could barely make out 3 words that would change everything we thought we knew about our situation. Someone in this community knew something about Diane, that we didn't know, something serious enough that they felt compelled to warn us, but not brave enough to come forward directly about what they discovered. The handwriting looked deliberately disguised, and the paper felt like it came from a cheap home printer. But the message was clear enough to make my blood run cold. Standing there staring at that note, I realized we weren't just dealing with an overzealous HA president who had gotten too aggressive about cabin inspections and community safety. What if the person who sent this warning knew exactly what Danda was running from? And we were about to find out the hard way. Officer Martinez arrived about 20 minutes later, driving slowly down our street like he was trying to assess the situation before getting out of his patrol car. I watched him through our window as he sat there for a moment, probably running through whatever information dispatch had given him about our dangerous property dispute. When he finally stepped out, he looked like a guy who'd responded to plenty of neighbor complaints and wasn't expecting anything too dramatic. Diane immediately rushed over to him, talking rapidly and gesturing toward our cabin, like she was reporting some kind of emergency situation. From where I stood, I could see her pulling out her stack of fake inspection papers and pointing at our dock with exaggerated concern. The officer listened patiently as Diane launched into her rehearsed speech about our illegal cabin modifications and lake monopoly, presenting her fake inspection papers as official county documents with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this performance multiple times. She kept using phrases like community endangerment and structural violations while pointing at perfectly legal parts of our property like they were ticking time bombs. Officer Martinez took notes and examined her papers, nodding occasionally, but not showing much reaction to her increasingly dramatic descriptions of the supposed safety threats we posed. I could tell he was being professionally polite, but something about his body language suggested he wasn't completely buying into Diane's version of events. Instead of just standing there recording like I'd been doing for days, I decided it was time to take charge of the situation and present our side of the story before Diane could completely control the narrative. I walked outside with Rachel carrying our property deed and the photos I'd taken of Diane trespassing on our deck and introduced myself to Officer Martinez with as much calm professionalism as I could manage. "Officer, I'm Daniel Carter, and this woman has been harassing us for days with forged documents, claiming she has authority to inspect our cabin," I said, handing him our property deed and pointing out the obvious spelling errors in Diane's fake papers. "She's been trespassing on our property and claiming to represent the county." Rachel stepped up beside me and calmly explained her background as a former county property paperwork checker, describing exactly what official inspection documents should look like and pointing out the specific ways Diane's papers were obviously fake. "These documents weren't issued by any county office," Rachel said, showing Officer Martinez the crooked stamp and cheap paper that Diane had used. "We called the county yesterday and confirmed they have no record of any inspection request for our property and no record of anyone named Diane Mercer being authorized to represent them." The officer's expression started changing as he compared our professional documentation with Diane's amateur forgeries. Diane's confidence started crumbling as Officer Martinez examined both sets of documents more carefully, asking pointed questions about her authority and credentials that she couldn't answer convincingly. "Ma'am, these inspection papers don't match the format used by the county," he said, holding up her fake documents with obvious skepticism. "And according to these property records, Mr. and Mrs. Carter own this lake and cabin legally, which means you are actually trespassing when you come onto their property without permission." Diane tried to interrupt with more claims about community safety, but Officer Martinez held up his hand and continued examining the evidence we presented. That's when the first major twist happened, the moment when Diane's elaborate scam started falling apart in real time. Officer Martinez looked up from the documents with a completely different expression. The kind of look cops get when they realize they're dealing with something more serious than a simple neighbor dispute. "Ma'am, these inspection papers aren't just unofficial. They're actually forged county documents, which is a serious crime," he said, his tone shifting from polite to professional concern. "According to these property records, the Carters own this lake and cabin legally, and you've been trespassing on their property while impersonating a county official." Diane's face went completely pale as the officer explained that what she'd been doing wasn't just harassment. It was actually multiple felonies. But Officer Martinez wasn't finished examining the situation. And what happened next made me realize we were dealing with someone who had a lot more to hide than just fake inspection papers. "I need to verify your identity for my report," he said, requesting Diane's driver's license with the kind of professional courtesy that cops use when they suspect something isn't right. As he walked back to his patrol car to run her information through the system, I watched Diane start to panic in a way that went far beyond someone just getting caught with fake documents. She kept looking toward her car like she was thinking about running, checking her watch and muttering under her breath about how this was all a misunderstanding. Rachel and I stood there watching Officer Martinez type Diane's information into his computer system. Both of us trying to process how quickly the situation had escalated from neighbor harassment to potential criminal charges. "I can't believe she thought she could get away with forged county documents," Rachel whispered. But I was starting to suspect there was something even bigger going on that we didn't know about yet. The way Diane was acting, pacing around and checking her phone obsessively, suggested she was more worried about getting her identity checked than about getting caught with fake papers. Something about her whole demeanor screamed that she was running from something serious. Officer Martinez spent what felt like forever in his patrol car typing and talking on his radio. While Diane grew more and more agitated beside us, she kept trying to get him to come back and discuss this reasonably, claiming that there had been a community miscommunication that didn't require any kind of official action. But the officer just held up his hand through the car window, indicating he needed more time to process whatever information he was finding in the system. Diane's panic was becoming more obvious by the minute, and I started to understand that our anonymous note sender had been trying to warn us about something much more serious than just a neighbor with control issues. When Officer Martinez finally got out of his patrol car and walked back toward us, his expression had changed completely from the polite, professional demeanor he'd arrived with. He looked serious, focused, and slightly surprised, like someone who'd expected to handle a simple neighbor complaint but had stumbled onto something much bigger. "M. Mercer," he said, using the formal tone that cops reserve for people who are about to have a very bad day. "I need you to step over here, please." Diane tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go, and I could see the exact moment when she realized her past had finally caught up with her. Standing there watching Officer Martinez approach Diane with that serious expression, I realized one thing for certain. There's no turning back now. Officer Martinez returned from his patrol car with an expression that told me everything had changed in the span of those few minutes he'd spent running Diane's background check. And this was about to become the most satisfying moment of my entire life. His professional demeanor had shifted from routine neighbor dispute mode to something much more serious. And I could see him mentally preparing for a conversation he hadn't expected to have when he first responded to this call. The irony was perfect because Diane had called the police on us thinking her fake authority would somehow intimidate us into submission. But she was about to discover that real authority doesn't play games. "Ms. Mercer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "I need you to step over here, please." And I watched Diane's eyes dart between the officer and her car, like she was calculating whether she could make a run for it. What Officer Martinez said next hit like a thunderbolt, and I felt this surge of vindication that was better than winning the lottery. "You currently have an active warrant for fraud charges from your previous state," he announced. And I watched Diane's face crumble as her worst nightmare became reality right there in our driveway where she'd been terrorizing us for days. The warrant was issued 18 months ago for defrauding homeowners through fake HOA assessments, and you've been a fugitive ever since. Officer Martinez continued in that calm, professional tone that cops use when they're delivering life-changing news. "Ms. Mills, you're under arrest for failure to appear on felony fraud charges, and will need to add forgery and impersonation charges for what you've been doing here." And I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. The truth about Diane Mills, now calling herself Mercer, unfolded like something out of a crime documentary as Officer Martinez explained her background to us, and every detail made our resistance look even more justified. She had fled fraud charges after running an elaborate scam in her previous community, collecting thousands of dollars from homeowners through fake HOA assessments and emergency repairs that never happened, which explained her obsession with establishing fake authority over our expensive lakefront property. When residents started questioning her authority and demanding receipts, she'd skip town, hoping to start fresh somewhere new. But apparently, she couldn't resist falling back into the same patterns that had made her a fugitive. Our cabin had been her target from the beginning, and everything about the inspection demands had been building toward some kind of financial scam that we'd accidentally prevented by refusing to give in. This was happening during the monthly community board meeting that was taking place in the community center just 50 yards from our cabin. And I could see neighbors starting to gather outside when they heard the police radio chatter. For just a moment, as Officer Martinez was explaining the charges, Diane's carefully constructed mask completely slipped, and I saw something that looked almost human underneath all the manipulation and desperation she'd been showing us for days. She started crying real tears this time and said she just wanted to belong somewhere, that she never meant for it to go this far. And for about 5 seconds, I actually felt sorry for her. But then the manipulative anger returned almost immediately and she started yelling about how we had set her up and how this was all some kind of conspiracy to destroy her life. And the switch from vulnerable to vicious happened so fast it gave me whiplash. Word about Diane's arrest spread through our small lakefront community faster than I thought possible. especially since half the neighbors had been watching the police car in our driveway and could see the handcuffs going on right there in broad daylight. My phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors who had supported Diane's fake safety campaign, and I could practically feel the collective embarrassment radiating from every house on our street as people realized they'd been defending a fugitive criminal. Owen Parker showed up at our door within 30 minutes of the arrest, looking absolutely devastated and asking if he could talk to us privately about how Diane had manipulated him into supporting her fake authority. "She told me you guys were planning to sue the HOA for harassment," he kept saying, running his hands through his hair like he couldn't believe what had happened and that I could be held personally liable if someone got hurt at your dock. Someone in the crowd that had gathered from the community meeting shouted, "Is that the woman who fined me for my paint color last month?" And suddenly, everyone was remembering all the suspicious citations and demands Diane had been making since she'd moved to our neighborhood. Rachel delivered what I still think was the perfect line as we watched Diane get handcuffed and placed in the back of Officer Martinez's patroller, and I could see several neighbors filming the whole thing on their phones. "Well," she said with that dry humor that had attracted me to her in the first place. "The cabin inspections finished and we found exactly what needed to be found." I burst out laughing despite everything we'd been through because my wife had just perfectly summarized this entire insane situation in one sentence while our tormentor was being arrested for multiple felonies. Officer Martinez conducted a thorough search of Diane's vehicle before transporting her to the county jail for processing. And what he discovered made everyone realize how close our entire community had come to systematic financial fraud. He discovered a detailed notebook with our neighbors' names and dollar amounts written next to each entry, showing that she'd been planning to target every expensive property in our community with fake violation claims based on property values she'd researched. Some families already had preliminary fee amounts listed, suggesting she'd been researching property values and planning her financial demands based on what she thought people could afford to pay without fighting back. The notebook also contained copies of official county letterhead that she'd been using to create more convincing forgeries and contact information for other communities where she'd apparently been considering relocating if her scheme here didn't work out. She built the rules to trap us and got caught in them herself. I thought as I watched the patrol car disappear down our street with Diane in the back seat. The most chilling discovery was a timeline Diane had created for implementing her cabin maintenance fee scam, with our property listed as Phase 1 testing and plans to expand to Phase 2 community-wide implementation within 60 days, which meant our refusal had saved everyone. She had been using our resistance as a way to just refine her approach and test which arguments would be most effective with different type of property owners. But instead of perfecting her criminal technique, she'd exposed herself to an entire community. If we had given in to her fake inspection demands, she would have moved on to demanding thousands of dollars for imaginary repairs and safety improvements, eventually targeting every lakefront property with similar schemes that would have bankrupted families. Rachel and I spent the rest of that afternoon giving detailed statements to Officer Martinez about everything Diane had done over the past week. From the initial fake inspection attempt to her trespassing and harassment campaign that had terrorized us, it felt surreal to be describing events that had seemed so threatening and confusing at the time, but now made perfect sense as part of a calculated criminal operation that had been doomed from the moment she picked the wrong targets. "You folks did everything right," Officer Martinez told us as he finished taking our statements. "And if you'd given in to her demands or failed to document everything, she probably would have succeeded in defrauding multiple families before anyone realized what was happening." But even as we celebrated Diane's arrest and the end of her fake authority campaign, I could see Rachel gripping my hand tightly as she stared out at the water. "Something tells me this isn't over yet," Rachel said. And I knew exactly what she meant, because communities don't just bounce back overnight from discovering they've been harboring a fugitive. Who else in our neighborhood knew about Diane's criminal past? And what were they planning to do about the fact that we just exposed them all? The emergency HOA meeting was called for 7 o'clock the following evening, and I'd never seen our community center so packed with tense, embarrassed, and confused neighbors trying to make sense of what had happened in their quiet lakefront neighborhood. The remaining board members, looking shell-shocked and defensive, had spent the day consulting with lawyers about their potential liability for supporting Diane's criminal activities. And everyone knew they were dealing with something way beyond typical HOA business. Owen Parker stood up first during the public comment period, his voice trembling as he read from a prepared statement about how he'd been misled about the nature and authority of the cabin inspection that had turned into a criminal arrest. "I need to make a formal apology to Daniel and Rachel Carter," he announced to the packed room, "for supporting what I now understand was criminal harassment of innocent homeowners who were protecting our entire community from systematic fraud." The board members who had accompanied Diane on her fake inspection expedition looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor as they publicly apologized for their involvement in what they now understood had been criminal harassment of law-abiding property owners. The nervous older gentleman stood up next, his face flushed as he explained how Diane had convinced them that emergency cabin inspections were necessary to protect the community from liability issues and insurance problems. The female board member was more direct, admitting that she'd had doubts about Diane's documentation from the beginning, but had been intimidated into going along with what seemed like official HOA business that was beyond her expertise. Both of them announced their immediate resignation from the board, acknowledging that they'd lost the community's trust and needed to step aside for new leadership that would implement proper verification procedures for all future official actions. Federal Agent Johnson's arrival at the meeting added a whole new level of seriousness to what everyone had assumed was just a local criminal matter involving one unhinged neighbor who had gotten too aggressive. Agent Johnson explained that Diane's fraud scheme had crossed state lines, making it a federal case that would require extensive investigation into her activities and any potential accomplices she might have had in our community. "We need to investigate whether Ms. Mills had any local accomplices or if this was part of a larger operation targeting HOA communities," she announced, which made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats like they had something to hide. The possibility that other community members might have been knowingly involved in the fraud scheme had clearly not occurred to most of our neighbors, but it was about to become very relevant. Owen made an additional statement that surprised everyone in the room and provided crucial information about how Diane had been manipulating community members behind the scenes through threats and intimidation. "She showed me legal documents about personal liability for HOA board members." He explained, his eyes darting nervously as he detailed exactly how the criminal had targeted him specifically. "She said that if someone got hurt at the Carter cabin dock, anyone who had questioned their safety compliance could be held personally, financially responsible for damages and insurance claims." The documents looked official and scared me into thinking that supporting her inspection demands was the only way to protect myself and my family from potential bankruptcy. But now I understand those were probably forged legal papers just like everything else she showed us. But not everyone in our community was ready to move on from what had happened. And some neighbors seemed more upset about the embarrassment of being fooled than about the actual criminal behavior that had been perpetrated against innocent homeowners trying to protect their property. Two families stood up and insisted that something was still wrong with that cabin structure and demanded that we prove our property ownership to the entire community by showing our deed and permits publicly for everyone to examine. "Just because she was a criminal doesn't mean there aren't real safety issues," one of them argued, apparently unable to accept that they'd been completely wrong about everything and had supported criminal harassment of their neighbors. Their resistance to acknowledging the truth created new tension in a room where people were already struggling to process their collective mistake and figure out how to rebuild trust. The community response split predictably between those who wanted to rally around us as the victims of criminal harassment and those who felt embarrassed about being fooled and wanted to move on quietly without acknowledging their mistakes. About half the room seemed genuinely relieved that the real criminal had been caught and wanted to thank us for standing up to systematic fraud that could have bankrupted multiple families. But the other half appeared to blame us for making this a big legal mess instead of just working it out neighborly. Several people suggested we should have just let Diane do her fake inspection to avoid all the drama, completely missing the point that giving in to her demands would have enabled her to defraud the entire community through fake emergency assessments and bogus repair fees. Agent Johnson revealed that federal investigators had uncovered evidence of a much larger criminal operation with Diane's activities extending far beyond what anyone in our community had realized during her brief residence here. The preliminary investigation showed that she had already collected preliminary cabin maintenance fees from 3 families using her fake inspection authority, promising them that early payment would reduce their overall assessment costs when the community-wide safety improvement project was implemented. Federal prosecutors would be seeking full restitution to all affected families, plus additional damages for harassment and defamation, which meant our community would receive significant financial compensation for the criminal activities that had disrupted our peaceful neighborhood. Some families who had paid her were embarrassed to admit they'd been scammed, while others were angry about having to wait for restitution from a federal investigation that was just beginning to uncover the scope of the criminal conspiracy. The meeting finally ended with a formal resolution passed by unanimous vote to implement new verification procedures for any future HOA business requiring multiple signatures and public documentation for any official communications or fee assessments from board members. Owen volunteered to serve as the new HOA treasurer with transparent accounting practices that would be audited quarterly by an independent firm. And several other neighbors stepped up to help rebuild trust in the community leadership through open book policies. "We're removing every citation Diane ever issued," the interim board president announced, "and any fees collected under her authority will be returned immediately while we wait for the federal investigation to conclude." As people filed out of the community center, I could feel the lingering tension and embarrassment that would probably take months to resolve, but also a sense of relief that the truth was finally out in the open. Rachel mailed Diane's own inspection notice back to her jail cell the next morning along with a photocopy of our property deed and a note that simply said, "Inspection complete, violations found." Which felt like the perfect final word on this entire nightmare. Looking around that room full of neighbors who had turned against each other over a criminal's lies, I realized that justice was definitely worth fighting for. Even when it temporarily divided a community that would eventually heal. But as we reached our cabin and looked out at the lake that we defended against systematic fraud, I knew we'd made the right choice, even if it had cost us some friendships along the way. Because protecting your community from real criminals is more important than keeping fake peace with people who refuse to acknowledge the truth. Turns out the only person who ever needed inspecting was Diane herself. And we just completed the most thorough background check our neighborhood had ever seen. What other secrets was our peaceful lakefront community about to discover during the federal investigation that was just getting started 6 months later? Rachel and I found ourselves sitting in the federal courthouse downtown, watching Diane Mills walk into the courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit and looking like a completely different person from the aggressive HOA president who had terrorized our neighborhood. The months in jail had taken their toll on her appearance, but more than that, she looked defeated in a way that went beyond just losing weight or getting pale from lack of sunlight. Her public defender, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, was shuffling through paperwork while explaining something to Diane in hushed tones. I expected this to be a straightforward plea hearing where Diane would accept responsibility for her crimes and we could finally close this chapter of our lives. The federal prosecutor, Agent Johnson, had prepared us for what should have been a routine proceeding where Diane would plead guilty to fraud, forgery, and impersonation charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's looking at probably 18 to 24 months in federal prison, plus full restitution to all victims, Agent Johnson had explained to us the week before. It's a fair deal considering the scope of her criminal operation and the number of families she defrauded across multiple states. Rachel and I were both relieved that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. And honestly, we just wanted to see Diane held accountable so we could move on with our lives. But as the judge called the case and Diane's public defender started outlining what I assumed would be a standard plea agreement, something unexpected happened that changed everything about what we thought we knew. Diane suddenly interrupted her own lawyer, speaking directly to the judge in a voice that was barely audible but clearly determined. "Your Honor, I need to tell them about the others," she said, ignoring her attorney's obvious shock and Agent Johnson's sudden alertness. "I wasn't working alone and there are people in that community who knew exactly what I was doing and helped me plan it." The courtroom went completely silent as everyone tried to process what we just heard. Agent Johnson immediately requested a recess to discuss this new development with Diane and her attorney, but the judge allowed Diane to continue speaking about what she claimed were accomplices in our community. 2 of the current HOA board members knew about my previous fraud charges and helped me target specific neighbors with expensive properties. She continued, her voice getting stronger as she spoke. They were feeding me information about property values, insurance policies, and which families would be most likely to pay fake assessments without asking too many questions. The judge looked as surprised as everyone else in the courtroom, but he allowed Diane to continue her confession. The details Diane revealed about her conspiracy painted a picture of systematic neighborhood fraud that was much more organized and local than anyone had realized. According to her testimony, the two board members who had accompanied her on the fake cabin inspection weren't just naive neighbors who had been manipulated into supporting her authority. They were active participants who had helped her research our family's financial background, property value, and insurance coverage to determine how much money they could potentially extract from us. We plan to claim the dock was environmentally hazardous and demand $50,000 for lake remediation from every lakefront property owner, Diane explained. The scope of what Diane and her accomplices had been planning was staggering and explained why she had been so persistent about establishing fake authority over our cabin. Our property wasn't just her target. It was her test case to prove that the intimidation and fake documentation strategy would work on the most expensive properties in the community. If Daniel and Rachel Carter had given in to the cabin inspection demands, we would have moved to Phase 2 and started collecting remediation fees from every family on the lake. She continued, the environmental hazard claims would have been impossible for homeowners to verify independently, and most people would have paid rather than risk losing their property insurance coverage. Agent Johnson signaled to federal officers waiting outside the courtroom, and within minutes, they were bringing in the two board members who had helped Diane plan and execute her fraud scheme. Watching these people I recognize from neighborhood meetings get arrested in federal court was surreal, especially since they had spent months pretending to be embarrassed victims of Diane's manipulation rather than willing participants in organized crime. The nervous older gentleman who had accompanied Diane to our cabin looked terrified as the handcuffs went on, while the woman who had resigned from the board after Diane's arrest maintained the same confident expression she'd worn during all her fake apologies. Diane's complete breakdown came as she realized that her confession had destroyed not just her own life, but the lives of people who had trusted her with their criminal conspiracy. "I just wanted what they had," she screamed at Rachel and me, her composure finally cracking completely. "These people with their lakious and perfect lives, why shouldn't I take some of that? Why should you get to own an entire lake when other people are struggling to pay their bills?" The judge had to call for order as Diane continued her rant about economic inequality and unfairness. But her words revealed the jealousy and entitlement that had motivated her crimes from the beginning. The legal consequences escalated dramatically once Diane's conspiracy confession was complete and the federal prosecutors had time to interview her accomplices separately. Instead of the 18 to 24-month sentence she had been offered for individual fraud charges, Diane was now facing extended prison time for organizing a criminal conspiracy that crossed state lines and involved multiple defendants. The judge announced that sentencing would be delayed for at least 6 months while federal investigators determined the full scope of the conspiracy and identified any additional victims or accomplices. This case has clearly expanded beyond the scope of individual fraud charges. The judge explained. "Walking out of that federal courthouse, I felt a strange mix of vindication and disbelief washing over me as I tried to process everything we just learned." Rachel gripped my hand tightly as we made our way through the parking lot. Both of us understanding that our quiet lakefront community would never be the same after discovering that it had been infiltrated by an organized criminal conspiracy. "I can't believe we were living next to people who were planning to rob us for months," Rachel said, shaking her head in amazement. As we drove home toward the lake that we had defended against systematic criminal assault, I suddenly realized something that stopped me cold and made me understand that this victory might just be the beginning of something much bigger than either of us had imagined. How many other HOA communities across the country were being targeted by similar criminal conspiracies? And what could we do to help protect them from the same systematic fraud we'd accidentally exposed? 2 years later, our first annual Honest Lake Day was everything I had hoped it would be when we started planning this community healing event. 40 neighbors gathered on our private beach, kids splashing safely in the water while their parents enjoyed barbecue and conversation without the underlying tension that had poisoned our community during the fraud conspiracy. The fake inspection notices were gone forever, replaced by a simple welcome to Carter Lake sign that acknowledged our legal ownership while inviting everyone to enjoy the water responsibly. Rachel and I decided to open our lake to the entire community every summer as a way of moving past the criminal harassment we'd endured and building the kind of neighborhood relationships that Diane's conspiracy had tried to destroy. Justice had been served in ways that exceeded our wildest expectations when the federal court handed down final sentences 18 months after Diane's confession. Diane Mills received 4 years in federal prison, plus full restitution to all targeted families, which included not just the money she had already collected, but also damages for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. The 2 board members who had been her accomplices get 2 years each for conspiracy to commit fraud. And all 3 defendants were ordered to pay additional fines that would fund new playground equipment and community improvements for our neighborhood. Diane's house had been sold by court order to satisfy the restitution requirements, and a young family with 2 small children had moved in, bringing laughter and normalcy back to a property that had been the headquarters for systematic criminal activity. The community transformation that followed the conspiracy arrests was remarkable and demonstrated how quickly neighborhoods can heal when criminal elements are removed and honest leadership takes over. Owen Parker became our new HOA president with a mandate for complete transparency requiring 3 signatures and public posting for any expenditure over $100. The community app now had strict verification rules for any official announcements, and every monthly meeting included a financial report with receipts and documentation available for anyone who wanted to review them. New families moving into the neighborhood received a packet explaining the fraud conspiracy history and the accountability measures we'd implemented to prevent future criminal infiltration. Rachel and I emerged from this ordeal stronger as a couple and more confident in our ability to handle conflicts together, which was an unexpected positive outcome from what had been the most stressful experience of our marriage. Our brief disagreement during the escalation phase had actually taught us to communicate better about handling serious problems, and we'd learned to trust each other's instincts even when we couldn't immediately see the best solution. "I'm glad you stood firm when I wanted to just give in to her demands," I told Rachel during our second annual Lake Day celebration. "You saved our community from systematic fraud by refusing to back down when it would have been easier to just let her do her fake inspection." The financial resolution exceeded what any of us had expected when the federal court calculated damages and restitution for all affected families. Every family that had been targeted by the conspiracy received full compensation for any money they had paid to Diane, plus additional damages for harassment and emotional distress. Our defamation and harassment settlement was substantial enough to fund the new playground equipment, upgraded community center facilities, and professional landscaping for the common areas that had been neglected during the period when criminal conspirators were mismanaging HOA finances. The federal court had essentially ordered the defendants to pay for comprehensive community improvements that made our neighborhood better than it had been before the criminal conspiracy began. Media attention brought our story to a much wider audience when a local news station produced a feature segment about the HOA fraud ring that targeted lakefront properties. The reporter interviewed Rachel and me about standing up to organized criminal harassment. And our story became a cautionary tale that was shared in HA newsletters and community management websites across the region. This case demonstrates the importance of verifying authority and demanding proper documentation when anyone claims to represent official agencies. The news anchor concluded, "Sometimes asking simple questions about credentials and authorization is all it takes to expose criminal fraud operations that target entire communities." The ripple effects of our case led to policy changes and increased awareness about HOA fraud that extended far beyond our small lakefront community. The federal investigation uncovered similar fraud schemes in 6 other states, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen money. Our case became a training example for federal agents and local police departments about how organized criminals infiltrate HOA leadership positions to commit systematic fraud. Law enforcement agencies now advise homeowners to always verify authority, demand proper documentation, and refuse entry to anyone who cannot prove their legitimate right to inspect private property. As sunset painted the lake in shades of gold and orange during our community celebration, Rachel raised her beer in a toast that perfectly captured how far we'd all come since those dark days of criminal harassment. "To cabin inspections that actually find what needs to be found," she announced, and I clinked her bottle while adding, "and to communities that protect each other from real criminals instead of attacking innocent neighbors." The laughter and applause that followed felt like the final healing of wounds that had divided our community during the conspiracy period. Children who had never known about the criminal fraud were playing together while their parents enjoyed the kind of relaxed neighborhood. Relationships that healthy communities are supposed to have. Looking back at everything we went through, I don't think the biggest lesson was about standing up to scammers or even catching a fugitive. Though, yeah, that was wild. What really stuck with me was how a community, even one as shaken and divided as ours, can come back stronger when people finally choose honesty over convenience. We didn't just kick out a fraud, we rebuilt something better. So, if someone ever bangs on your door claiming inspection authority, ask for credentials, call the real office, and trust your gut. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one telling the truth. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have done the same thing? Like and subscribe. If this story hit home and if you feel like supporting more real-life chaos breakdowns, you can always hit that little thanks button. Stay sharp out there, neighbors. Not every knock at the door is just a knock. Thanks for watching HOA Defender Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your